Okay, I want to talk about your letters of recommendation. I'm a professor and I've been on my graduate admissions committee for several years now. And I would estimate that about 80% of letters of recommendation are poorly written. And by poorly written, I mean they don't have the information they need to really help your application. So what are some examples of that? Well, you might have a professor that you've had for 1 or 2 classes, okay? But that person is going to have a hard time of writing about you in detail. Maybe you have a mentor from an outside social organization. That person probably doesn't know the format that this letter needs to be in. If you have an off-campus job, what about your boss writing you a letter? Well, they're probably not going to talk about the right things that they need to talk about. They might talk about your work performance or something, or how on time you are. So there's a lot of pitfalls related to these letters, but then there's also a lot of things that you can do to actually get better letters from your letter writers. So what I want to do in this video is I want to go over 5 tips for getting better letters of recommendation. And my focus is on graduate school, if you're in college going to graduate school, but a lot of these tips work if you just need a letter of reference for a job that you're going into, and you can tailor that advice for your specific situation. Okay, so tip number 1. You need to choose your letter writers carefully. The default norm for professors is that when we're asked to write letters of reference, we automatically say yes, because we consider it part of our job. But that doesn't necessarily get you a strong letter of reference. So what you want to do is ask someone if they can write you a strong letter of reference. And if they can't say that they will, then you want to thank them for being honest, and then you move on down your list of your next letter writers. The other thing when choosing a letter writer is that you can't assume that all professors or supervisors understand the graduate school process. So you really need to do your homework and choose someone who knows how to write a letter and has experience writing letters for other students. All right, tip number 2, ask them very far in advance. You want to ask your letter writers at least 4 months in advance if they haven't written you a letter before. And the reason for that is because writing a good letter is really labor intensive, and the people that you're asking are probably busy folks. Specifically, if it's a letter for a grad school application, we're probably writing multiple letters at a time for multiple students. This amount of time also lets you sit down with your letter writer and have discussions with them about what your goals are, what your career plans, more detail about your trip through college and how they can use that information to write a better letter. If your letter writer is someone that you want advice and mentorship from about graduate school, then it's even better to start this conversation further out, say 6 months before the application deadlines. All right, tip number 3, give them the information they need to write you a good letter. This starts with the instructions, the prompts, the information about the fellowship or school that you're applying to. The next thing you want to give them is your updated CV or resume. Then you want to go one step further and give them the personal statement that you're writing for this application and any other documents that you're writing that go in submitted with your application. Hopefully this person that's writing you this letter is willing to sit down, read all this information, digest it, follow up with you on any questions that they have about your background or your motivations, things like that, and they can put that information in the letter. If you're enjoying this video so far, I would so appreciate it if you could hit the subscribe button. It really helps. Okay. Tip number 4, and this one might sound a little controversial, so just hear me out on it. But tip number 4, you want to tell them what to say. So this tip goes one step further than the last step, tip number 3, about giving them all your application material. What you really want to tell your letter writer is what qualities or aspects about you that you want them to highlight in their letter. To go along with this, you should tell them who your other letter writers are, and tell them the perspective that those other letter writers are writing about. So for example, if they're professors from your class or research advisors in another project or etc. Let's take an example. You're asking for a letter from an undergraduate research advisor. And when you sit down with them to discuss your application and your letter, you say, I'd like you to highlight how I work independently. Let's look at another example. You're asking for a letter from a class instructor, perhaps from several classes. And you can say to them, I'd like you to talk about how I can work well in a group in a collaborative environment. So you can make a list of all the qualities that you think make you qualified for graduate school, and then you can make sure that each of those qualities get mentioned in at least one of the letters that you're submitting by someone who has direct experience and can speak to how well you do that. Okay, last one, tip number 5, remind and follow up. I can tell you from being a relatively new professor that I'm so busy that I forget things all the time. So please, please, please send me reminders. I promise not to be offended. Send all your letter writers periodic reminders. If you don't get an acknowledgement or confirmation of submission of the letter, just continue to follow up. It's important that you remain polite and you be understanding of people's workloads, especially, in 2020. And you should also understand that academic deadlines are really fluid. There's an application deadline for the student, but we typically understand that letters are going to come in anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks beyond that deadline, and they'll still be completely read and accepted and evaluated. All right, so if there are other tips you think I missed, please leave them down in the comments. I'd love to read them. And stay tuned and subscribe if you want to see more videos about surviving grad school and undergrad tips.